Hello, Akira here. Welcome back for another Fire Emblem video essay. Today's topic is devil weapons and drawback mechanics, starting with a short overview of how they've been handled within the mainline games. After that, I'll be covering additional possibilities, both those that have been explored in ROM hacks and further thinking about what some potential ideas could be, including for Fire Emblem resources other than weapons. As always, you can find timestamps for the relevant sections in the video description, but without further ado, let's jump into a short overview of devil weapons. Devil weapons first appeared in Fire Emblem 1, with the Devil Axe being given to Marth if he visits the village in Chapter 3. The Devil Axe is the most common devil weapon, but sometimes, like in Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia, the preeminent usable devil weapon is instead a sword. Devil weapons have been present for most of the games in the series as of Engage's release, ultimately being present in 11 of the 17 games. It's easier to list where they aren't present, those games being FE4, Genealogy of the Holy War, the Tellius games, FEs 9 and 10, Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, FEs 13 and 14, Awakening and Fates, and Engage. Outside of their Three Houses iteration, which I will cover later, they are characterised by high might and having a chance of backfiring against the user, damaging them in the process. In most of the games where it's present, this backfire damage is based on how much damage the user will do to the opponent, with the exception of the DSFE games, FEs 11 and 12, where the backfire damage is instead based on the damage the user would deal to themselves. In all of the games where they appear other than in Three Houses, the likelihood of a devil weapon backfiring is affected by unit stats. In the vast majority of these cases, the relevant stat is luck, with the sole exception being FE6, where the relevant unit stat is instead the unit's displayed level, i.e. a level 10 fighter would be counted as level 10, whereas a level 4 berserker would be counted as level 4 regardless of promotion level. In all of these games, the maximum percentage chance of backfire from which the stat value is subtracted always exceeds the cap of the relevant stat by 1, meaning that if there are no other mitigating factors, then there will always be a chance for the devil weapon to backfire. The reason why I have to stipulate the no other mitigating factors part is that, well, there are additional factors that contribute to the backfire rate of devil weapons in some games. For example, in FE3, the Devil Axe is programmed to never backfire on enemies, meaning that especially in Book 2, where there are no playable axe users, the Devil Axe is functionally just a strong, standard axe that happens to be enemy only. This player-only consequence is also the case for the Shadow Sword in the second Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem Gaiden. More interesting though I think about the Shadow Sword in Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia is the fact that its backfire chance is mitigated entirely or somewhat when wielded by Dread Fighters. In the case of Gaiden, this is mitigated entirely, meaning that once again, it's just a very strong weapon in this context. Curiously, in the case of Shadows of Valentia, the Dread Fighter mitigation rate, and even the basis of the non-Dread backfire rate, isn't documented on any of the Fire Emblem informational sites. So if someone would happen to actually know this, then I would be very interested. Anyway, despite the obvious downside of having a chance to hurt yourself, potentially even leading to a unit killing themselves, including in particularly embarrassing situations, like against a wall, its high might can provide a potential solution in a theoretical pinch. There is also some utility to the Devil Axe in FEs 7 and 8, for training additional axe rank quickly, as each use of the Devil Axe gives a massive 8 weapon experience in both games, compared to 1 for most axes and 2 for select ones. As I mentioned previously, the Three Houses iteration of devil weapons work differently from all of the other devil weapons. Instead of having a chance to backfire, the Three Houses devil weapons of the Devil Axe, Devil Sword, and Cursed Ashia Sword are instead guaranteed to deal non-lethal recoil damage to the user after the round of combat. This is sometimes used as a method for setting up low health builds, such as Van Wrath or Vengeance. That brings us quite nicely onto additional drawback mechanics, as this non-lethal post-combat recoil isn't a feature limited solely to the devil weapons in Three Houses. The recoil also applies to relics when held by non-crest bearers, with separate recoil for weapons and equipable items, meaning that a non-crest bearer can take up to 20 recoil damage per round of combat. This is particularly a boon for Dedue and Cyril to set up Vengeance. It's been noted by several people that Bernadetta's own Vengeance would be easier to set up if she didn't have her minor crest of Indec, with its effect of having a 10% chance per hit with a physical weapon outside of combat art of proccing an additional weapon attack. It isn't even a crest that at all benefits the strength of her Vengeance, or even her other exclusive combat art and closer. As a result, though she is generally already considered to be one of the game's premier combat units on Maddening mode, there is a very fair argument to be made that she would be a better unit if she didn't have her crest. Drawbacks to using certain weapons is also the case for many weapons in Fates, as part of its weapon balancing system. In fact, there's even a weapon that you can get as a My Castle drop that deals guaranteed recoil after each round of combat in the form of the Berserker's Axe, which reduces the wielder's HP by 30% of their max HP after each round of combat they take part in. That being said, most weapon drawbacks are less severe, and typically, not always, go something along the lines of 1-2 range weapons are unable to crit, double, or trigger offensive skills, in addition to reducing the wielder's effective speed by 5, which is a full doubling threshold, and thus makes them more prone to getting doubled. Silver weapons and the Brave Lightning Tome decrease the user's relevant offensive stat and skill by 2 after usage, with both stats recovering by 1 per turn. Brave weapons decrease both defense and res by 4. For the physical S-rank weapons, the unit's strength is halved post-battle until they attack again. It is worth noting that in the case of the 1-2 range weapon quote-unquote drawback of being unable to crit and trigger offensive skills, this may not, in fact, be a drawback if you are intentionally trying to feed someone a kill. Still, overall, this weapon of weapon drawbacks even outside of the typical devil effect creates a very interestingly balanced weapon system that I think is worth mentioning. For anyone who's played a game where this is a factor, aka anything other than FE12, Awakening, or Fates, you may have thought of another quote-unquote drawback mechanic for weapons in the form of weapon weight, including its relation to con in any games where it exists in some form. While this is definitely the case, and I do think that weight and con are interesting, and therefore may make a video essay on them at some point, these are beyond the scope of this video. Instead, next I'll move on to a brief overview of how the devil and drawback systems have been expanded on in hacks. The biggest thing perhaps for the evolution of the devil system in hacks using FE8 as a base is the implementation of additional devil skills with skill system, of which there are 3. From least to most beneficial for the unit in question, these are as follows. Devil's Whim. This unit is cursed, but the curse spreads to the enemy as well, with a 31 minus luck % chance of devil reversal. This applies regardless of weapon used, and means that given a standard GBA luck cap of 30, your unit is always able to hurt themselves outside of the possibility of equipping something that gives a luck stat boost, such as the Sacred Twin Bow the Nidhogg in FE8. Devil's Luck. Immune to devil reversal. Gives units devil reversal to the enemy. Notably, this means that in order for the backfire effect to be possible on the enemy as a result of this skill, the unit has to have a devil weapon equipped of their own. Lastly, Devil's Pact. Immune to devil reversal. Curses the enemy with devil reversal. Understandably, the relative benefit of the last two can be switched depending on the context. Since Devil's Luck requires the usage of a devil weapon by the unit with the skill in order to give the unit's devil reversal to the enemy, this means that you can control whether there is a chance of devil reversal backfiring on them. Still, they are the same when the unit in question has a devil weapon equipped, and having recently played SME's FE8 remake of the lost Fire Emblem game BSFE Arcanea Saga, where Devil's Luck is present on one of the maps, I can confirm that is absolutely hilarious. Another funny thing that was apparently the case in some older memey FE8 hacks is that exceeding the luck cap could cause the devil reversal chance to underflow, and thus make it highly likely to backfire. In terms of ROM hack weapons with interesting drawbacks, I have a couple of examples from Resner's Two Milkmen Go comedy, as I really like a lot of their design choices. Firstly, while equipped, the Danger Pick doubles the damage that the Eula deals and takes. Unsurprisingly, this makes it easier to kill any one given enemy, while also being an extremely bad weapon to hold on to on enemy phase. Therefore, it should either be traded away in favour of something else, or you should position your other units to block off the wielder accordingly. The second example is the Morning Star, a siege tome with the full range of the wielder's magic, and that is capable of doubling, making it potentially very strong for getting rid of faraway threats. However, as its drawback, if hit, the holder will instantly die, once again making it something that is both powerful and also has a major weakness that you have to work around. Lastly, leaning fully into the speculative, how could drawbacks be further explored in the future of Fire Emblem? I have a few ideas about this, but in order to avoid rambling too much, I'll limit myself to 3 ideas. Something that I think could be very interesting would be imposing some sort of drawback on movement staves, as they're incredibly strong. Warp is, of course, the movement staff in most games, Engage being an exception where often rewarp is more useful. Thanks, Micaiah. There are a couple ways in which I think a limitation for a quote-unquote devil warp of sorts could be implemented. Firstly, the movement staff could prevent the holder from moving whilst it is equipped. This would mean that unless you wait a turn between warping, or you use the action of another unit to switch around the staffer's inventory, such as a dancer trading around their inventory before dancing them, you would be limited in terms of any further units that you'd be able to warp forward. Secondly, in a game where warp range is dependent on the user's magic, you could have a warp staff with more uses and lower weapon rank requirement, perhaps even with slightly higher warp range, that permanently lowers the staffer's magic after usage. For some people, it would definitely feel bad to permanently lose stats, and therefore lead to the hoarding of movement staves again. Still, I think it could be interesting to see what the result of such a system would be, as especially in Free Houses Engage, warping is very centralizing. This is said partly because as an LTCer, I know that such a drawback would still see movement staves be used at points. Even a staff that is solely the same as reposition would likely find multiple applications in an LTC. Another stat eater that could be interesting is a consumable that provides a temporary stat boost in exchange for permanent stat loss after the end of the map. Once again, this is something that I could see being useful for certain tile movement thresholds for warping. Even beyond that though, it could just be a good thing to use on a temporary unit to maximise their combat usefulness for an extra stint before they would get benched by people anyway. Lastly, linking back into the actual backfiring effect of the Devil Reversal, in a game where skills are learned by level up with individual character skill sets such as in Vision Quest and Code of the Burger King, you could have one of them for the J-Gun be Devil's Whim. Credits to my friend Danny Doyle for the initial idea prompt. In doing so, you'd make them less reliable in every sense, as they could both injure themselves and also deal extra damage to the enemy through them triggering Devil Reversal on themselves. As such, it would incentivize the player to move away from relying on their J-Gun for a reliability reason, rather than the not always accurate idea that they will fall off stat-wise. An additional reason why I think this particular idea could be interesting is an FE8 Japanese event item called the Juna Fruit, which randomly reduces the user's level by 1 to 5 without affecting their stats, and thus giving them extra room to grow. This idea has been implemented in the GBA demake of Shadows of Valentia, Sacred Echoes, in the form of our beloved sack of flour. If you were able to unlearn skills learned by reaching a certain level, this could extend the period that the J-Gun is useful for as a combat unit, which with appropriate unit balancing and bases, could be a reasonable and considered tactical choice. So, that's been a brief overview of how Fire Emblem has handled both the devil weapons and weapon balancing in both mainline games and hacks, in addition to how these concepts could be developed further. Hopefully you learned something, or learned about a cool hack, or just enjoyed watching. What do you think about how drawbacks have been handled so far, and how do you think that they could continue to be explored in the future of the series? Of course, due to the nature of Fire Emblem ROM hacking continuing to evolve, this video is simply an overview, even just at the time of me writing the script. So if you know of any particularly interesting direction that a weapon drawback has been taken in a hack that I haven't mentioned here, please do let me know in the comments, as I'd be very interested. Thank you to the good people of the wonderful Danny Doyle's community, the video idea, and to Retina for providing relevant footage of his hack, 2 Milkmen Go Comedy, which is highly recommended. And of course, thank you for watching. I enjoyed writing this video essay a lot, so I hope that you enjoyed it as well. If there are any topics that you'd be interested in my thoughts on, please do tell me. Regardless, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you again next time. Until then, have a good one.